The darkness came first, a suffocating, disorienting blackness that swallowed sound, sight, and sense. When the impact came, it wasn't the sudden jolt many of the survivors expected. It was an agonizing descent, drawn out over minutes as the spacecraft screamed through an alien atmosphere. The hull groaned and buckled, panels ripping free and sparks dancing in the air like fireflies. Gravity was an enemy, slamming bodies into walls and debris as the ship shuddered violently. Then, silence. When Lieutenant Kara Niven opened her eyes, the world swam with blurred edges and ringing noise. Blood dripped from a gash on her forehead, but she barely registered the pain. Her hands fumbled for the release of her harness, and when she fell to the ground, she realized the floor wasn't level. The cabin had tilted, half buried in the soft crimson dirt outside. "Kara," a voice rasped. It was Marcus Hall, the ship's engineer, crawling toward her. His face was pale, smeared with soot and blood. "Are you—" "I'm fine," she cut him off, her throat dry and raw. Her eyes darted around the wreckage. Smoke curled from exposed wiring, and the sickly smell of burning insulation hung heavy in the air. Nearby, a woman whimpered, clutching her arm, which hung at an unnatural angle. Marcus helped Kara to her feet, and together they moved through the broken corridors, calling out for survivors. They found Dr. Ilara Voss pinned beneath a support beam, her leg twisted. It took 3 of them to lift it, the weight leaving their hands trembling. As they worked, more survivors emerged from the wreckage, disheveled, bleeding, and silent with shock. Their numbers were fewer than Kara had hoped, much fewer. They stumbled out into the open, greeted by a landscape that defied logic. The ground was a deep, rust-colored expanse, cracked and dry like ancient clay. The sky above was a dim, bruised red, with a massive, swollen sun looming too close for comfort. Jagged spires of rock jutted from the earth, some spiraling like broken tusks, others curved unnaturally, as though grown rather than formed. The survivors gathered in a haphazard cluster, their expressions blank, their movements robotic. Kara counted them, 12, maybe 13, and felt the weight of their loss. There had been 42 souls aboard the Horizon Dawn. The odds of finding more alive seemed slim. "We need to take stock," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Injuries, supplies, anything we can salvage." Her words spurred some into action, but others remained frozen, their eyes scanning the alien horizon as if expecting something to emerge. Kara didn't blame them. She felt it too. A prickling at the back of her neck, as though the planet itself were watching them. Hours passed as they scavenged what they could from the wreckage. Water, food rations, and emergency medical kits were gathered into a small pile. Marcus managed to rig a temporary shelter using pieces of the ship's hull, and the group huddled beneath it as the first night fell. That was when the true alienness of the planet became clear. The darkness wasn't complete. Strange bioluminescent orbs floated in the distance, their glow pulsating like a heartbeat. The ground emitted a faint vibration, almost imperceptible, but constant. And the sounds, soft clicks, guttural growls, and the occasional shrill cry came from nowhere and everywhere at once. They took turns keeping watch, but exhaustion soon claimed even the most vigilant. Kara fought sleep for as long as she could, clutching a makeshift spear fashioned from a piece of jagged metal. When her eyes finally closed, her dreams were filled with jagged shapes and the echo of a scream she couldn't place. She awoke to chaos. The camp was in disarray, survivors scrambling to their feet, shouting incoherently. A trail of blood led away from the shelter toward the jagged rocks in the distance. Missing was Corporal Jace, one of the soldiers who had been on watch. Kara's heart hammered as she followed the trail. It ended abruptly at a shallow depression in the ground, where something dark and glistening pooled, a mix of blood and an unidentifiable black substance that shimmered unnaturally. Nearby, claw marks gouged into the earth, wide and deep enough to make her stomach churn. "Everyone back to camp," she ordered, her voice sharp despite the dread pooling in her gut. "Now!" When they returned, they found Jace, or what was left of him. His body was mangled, barely recognizable, with strips of flesh hanging from his exposed ribs. What stood out most were the growths, slick, spindly appendages sprouting from his torso like warped branches. They twitched, even in death. Panic erupted. Some screamed, others vomited, and a few stared in mute horror. Kara stepped forward, forcing her shaking hands to remain steady as she examined the body. The growths were unlike anything she'd ever seen, organic yet unnatural, their texture somewhere between cartilage and chitin. They pulsed faintly as though alive. "Stay together," she said, turning to the others. "No one wanders off alone. We don't know what we're dealing with, but it's hunting us." Her words hung heavy in the air, the weight of them settling over the group like a shroud. The survivors clung to one another, their fear palpable, their hope dwindling. In the distance, the bioluminescent orbs grew brighter, their glow reflecting in the blood pooling at Kara's feet. She couldn't shake the feeling that the planet itself was alive, and it wanted them to stay. The alien sun hung low in the sky, casting everything in hues of rust and decay. The survivors moved with quiet desperation, their numbers thinned by injuries and fear. After the first night's attack, they had little choice but to regroup and prepare for the inevitable. Kara had taken charge, her voice steady despite the hollow terror she carried inside. "We don't have the luxury of waiting around," she said, pacing in front of the makeshift shelter. "We need food, water, and weapons. We split into teams. No one goes alone." The group nodded reluctantly. The tension was suffocating, each person's face etched with exhaustion and paranoia. Their trust in one another was already eroding, their fear of what lurked in the shadows outweighing any sense of unity. Marcus and Dr. Alara joined Kara in planning the search. They mapped out areas to explore using scraps of the ship's navigation system and a basic compass cobbled together from salvaged parts. The crash site marked their starting point, but beyond that, the terrain grew increasingly hostile. Jagged cliffs, dense clusters of alien vegetation, and the ever-present spires that loomed like broken teeth. The first day of scouting yielded little success. Kara's team, composed of Marcus and a civilian named Layla, ventured toward a cluster of the glowing orbs they'd seen at night. Up close, the orbs were suspended from translucent stalks, their surfaces smooth but strangely warm to the touch. Marcus took a sample, carefully storing it in a makeshift container. As they continued, they came across the remains of another creature, This one distinctly alien. Its body was a tangled mass of muscle and sinew, with no discernible head. The rib-like structures protruding from its chest were shredded, as if something massive had torn it apart. Black ichor oozed from the wounds, pooling in the dirt and steaming faintly. Layla gagged at the sight, turning away. Marcus knelt down to examine the carcass, his face pale but determined. "It's fresh," he muttered. "Whatever killed it, it's still close." Kara's eyes scanned the horizon, her grip tightening on the sharpened piece of metal she carried as a weapon. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the glowing stalks and the distant hiss of wind through the spires. "Let's move," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're exposed out here." They made it back to camp as the alien sun dipped below the horizon. The others returned as well, carrying meager supplies, some twisted roots that might be edible, a small pool of brackish water that would need filtering, and scraps of metal for reinforcing the shelter. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, the air grew colder and the sounds of the planet intensified. The survivors huddled together, their makeshift weapons clutched tightly. The clicking sounds grew louder, closer, interspersed with guttural growls that seemed to echo from every direction. Then, the first scream. Kara was on her feet in an instant, her heart pounding as she scanned the darkness. The scream came from the far edge of the camp, where one of the civilians, a young man named Julian, had been keeping watch. By the time they reached him, it was too late. His body lay sprawled on the ground, his chest torn open. The gaping wound revealed not just broken ribs, but something far worse. The flesh around the injury had begun to change, dark veins spreading outward like ink in water. Small, twitching tendrils extended from the edges of the wound, writhing as if searching for something. The survivors froze, horror etched on their faces. Kara knelt beside the body, her stomach churning. The black ichor pooled beneath Julian, glistening in the dim light. "What the hell is this?" Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. Before Kara could respond, a sound cut through the air, a deep, guttural growl that sent chills down her spine. The group turned as one, their makeshift weapons raised, but the darkness revealed nothing. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of something heavy dragging against the ground. "Back to the shelter!" Kara barked, her voice cracking with urgency. "Now!" They stumbled through the camp, their breaths ragged and their footsteps frantic. Just as they reached the relative safety of the shelter, the creature emerged from the shadows. It was a towering, sinewy figure, its translucent skin stretched tight over a grotesque frame. Its limbs were elongated, with claws that glinted like obsidian. The eyeless face turned toward them, its cavernous maw parting to reveal rows of jagged teeth that seemed to move independently. The creature lunged, its speed defying its size. It snatched a soldier named Reyes, dragging him screaming into the night. The others could do nothing but watch, paralyzed by fear. In the silence that followed, only Kara's ragged breathing broke the stillness. She forced herself to speak, her voice hoarse but firm. "It's hunting us," she said, "and it's smarter than we thought." The survivors spent the rest of the night reinforcing their defenses, but the futility of their efforts weighed heavily on them. They had seen the creature now, and they knew it wasn't just a mindless predator. It was calculating, patient, and terrifyingly efficient. The next morning they found Reyes, or what remained of him. His body was mutilated, his flesh stripped in places to reveal muscle and bone. Like Julian, his wounds were surrounded by black veins and writhing tendrils. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't just killing them, it was changing them. The survivors' fear turned inward. Paranoia began to take hold, their trust in one another eroding with every passing moment. Kara fought to maintain order, but she could see it in their eyes, the seeds of doubt, the creeping suspicion that any one of them could be next. The hunt had begun, and the survivors knew there was no escape, not from the creature, not from the planet, and most terrifying of all, not from what they were becoming. The dawn brought no respite. The pale light of the alien sun revealed a desolate camp marked by exhaustion and fear. The survivors sat in silence, their eyes hollow, their movements sluggish. The previous night's attack had left them shaken, and the mutilated remains of Reyes, now buried beneath a shallow mound of dirt, served as a grim reminder of their precarious reality. Kara stood apart from the group, staring into the horizon. The creature's calculated assault wasn't just about feeding. It was a message. It was testing them, wearing them down, learning their patterns. She didn't voice her thoughts, but she saw the same realization dawning on the others. They weren't just prey. They were being studied. The discovery of the infection came later that morning, when Jonas, the mechanic, collapsed while working to fortify their shelter. His breath was ragged, his skin glistening with sweat. At first, they thought it was dehydration or exhaustion. But then Marcus rolled up Jonas's sleeve and froze. Black veins spiderwebbed across his arm, radiating from a small, unnoticed cut. "What is that?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. Jonas looked down at his arm, his eyes widening in horror. I didn't even notice the scratch." The cut was shallow, but the veins surrounding it pulsed faintly, as though alive. Dr. Elara stepped forward, her expression grim but composed. She motioned for Jonas to sit, then began examining the wound with the limited medical tools they'd salvaged. "It's not just an infection," she said, her voice tight. "It's growing, changing him." Her words sent a ripple of panic through the group. Layla backed away, her hands trembling. "What if it's contagious?" she whispered. "What if we're all infected?" "It's not airborne," Elara snapped, though the confidence in her voice seemed forced. "But we need to isolate him," Jonas protested, his voice weak. "I'm fine, I can still—" "No," Kara interrupted, her tone firm but pained. "You're not. We can't take chances." They moved Jonas to a small, makeshift enclosure at the edge of camp, using pieces of the wreckage to create a barrier. He sat inside, his head in his hands, while the others watched from a distance, their fear palpable. By nightfall, Jonas's condition had worsened. The black veins had spread to his chest and neck, and small, spiny protrusions began to emerge from his skin. He writhed in pain, his breathing shallow and labored. The sounds he made, half screams, half growls, were unlike anything human. Kara stood outside the enclosure, her grip tight on her makeshift spear. Marcus approached her, his face pale. "We can't let this go on," he said quietly. "He's turning into one of them." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on Jonas. The others were watching too, their fear mirrored in her own heart. She knew Marcus was right, but the thought of taking a life, especially one of their own, was a weight she wasn't sure she could bear. As the second night fell, the infection claimed Jonas completely. His screams ceased, replaced by an unnatural silence. When Kara and Marcus approached the enclosure, they found him standing, his body twisted and grotesque. His limbs had elongated, his skin mottled with patches of translucent tissue that revealed the sinew and muscle beneath. His eyes were gone, replaced by dark, empty sockets, and his mouth, lined with jagged alien teeth, twitched as though struggling to form words. "Jonas?" Kara said, her voice barely above a whisper. The creature that had been Jonas turned its head toward her, tilting it unnaturally. For a moment it stood still, as if recognizing her. Then it lunged. The attack was sudden and ferocious. Kara barely managed to dodge, the creature's claws slicing through the air where her head had been moments before. Marcus shouted, driving a sharpened metal rod into the creature's side, but it didn't stop. It lashed out, striking him across the chest and sending him sprawling. Kara reacted instinctively. She drove her spear into the creature's neck, the force of the blow pinning it to the ground. It thrashed wildly, black ichor spraying from the wound, but she didn't relent. With a final desperate push, she drove the spear deeper until the creature's movements ceased. The camp was silent, save for Kara's ragged breathing. She looked down at what remained of Jonas, her hands trembling. The others emerged from the shadows, their expressions a mix of horror and relief. "We can't let this happen again," Elara said, her voice shaking. "We need to understand what we're dealing with. If anyone else shows symptoms—" "I know," Kara interrupted, her tone hollow. "We'll do what needs to be done." The survivors burned Jonas's body that night, the flames casting long, flickering shadows across the camp. No one spoke, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down on them like a shroud. Elara spent the following days studying the black ichor, using the limited tools they had salvaged. She discovered that it wasn't just a byproduct of the creature's attacks. It was alive, a parasitic organism that invaded its host and rewrote their biology at a cellular level. The infection wasn't random, it was deliberate, a means of propagation. The knowledge brought no comfort. Every scrape, every cut, became a potential death sentence. The survivors grew increasingly paranoid, their mistrust of one another deepening with each passing day. Arguments broke out over the smallest things. Who should keep watch? Who should lead? Who might already be infected? Kara tried to hold them together, but she could feel the group unraveling. The creature wasn't just hunting them, it was breaking them, turning their fear against them. And in the shadows beyond the camp, the creature watched, waiting. The planet was quieter now, but the quiet carried a weight that crushed them. The survivors, down to 4, moved with haunted expressions, their eyes sunken and their bodies scarred. Kara led them through the jagged terrain toward the monolith, her every step purposeful, yet burdened with dread. Behind her, Marcus, Layla, and Doctor. Elara followed, their movements mechanical. They had nothing left but the grim determination to end the nightmare. The monolith loomed ahead, a grotesque structure pulsing faintly in the dim red light of the alien sun. Up close, its surface resembled flesh more than stone, slick and warm to the touch. It emitted a low-frequency hum that resonated in their bones, a sound that seemed to erode their sanity the longer they listened. "It's alive," Alara whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at it. "It's the source, the hive mind." Kara nodded, her jaw tight. "Then we destroy it." The plan was simple in its desperation. Use the remaining explosives from the wreckage to detonate the monolith. They had cobbled together a makeshift timer, though Marcus had warned them the device was unstable at best. The slightest miscalculation could set it off prematurely, or not at all. As they prepared the explosives, the monolith began to react. Its pulsing light grew brighter, the hum rising in pitch until it became an agonizing screech. The ground beneath them trembled, and from the shadows emerged the creatures. They came in numbers far greater than any of them had imagined. The original predator was there, its grotesque form towering over the others, but it was no longer alone. Smaller creatures, equally monstrous, swarmed around it, twisted amalgamations of flesh and bone that moved with the same predatory grace. Their eyeless faces turned toward the survivors, their maws opening in a chorus of guttural growls. "Hold them off!" Kara shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Marcus and Layla stepped forward, wielding makeshift weapons with a determination born of despair. Ilara worked frantically to arm the explosives, her fingers trembling as she connected wires and calibrated the timer. The creatures attacked with terrifying speed, their movements a blur of claws and teeth. Marcus managed to impale one with a jagged spear, but another leapt onto him, its claws tearing into his chest. He screamed, blood spraying across the dirt, but he didn't stop fighting. With a final burst of strength, he drove his weapon into the creature's head, even as it dragged him to the ground. Layla screamed his name but had no time to grieve. A smaller creature lunged at her, and she swung a metal rod, the force of the blow snapping its neck. She turned to face another, only to be tackled to the ground. It sank its claws into her abdomen, and her scream was cut short as its teeth tore into her throat. "Layla!" Alara cried, tears streaming down her face. Kara grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Focus!" Kara shouted. "Get it done!" Alara forced herself to continue, her vision blurred by tears. The timer was set, the explosives primed. She looked at Kara, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. "It's ready," she said, her voice barely audible over the screeching creatures. Kara nodded. "Go! I'll hold them off." "No," Ilara said, her voice breaking. "We have to." "Go!" Kara roared, shoving her toward the path they had come from. Ilara hesitated for a heartbeat before turning and running, her sobs echoing in the empty expanse. Kara turned back to face the monolith, the creatures swarming around it. She held her spear tightly, her knuckles white. "This ends here," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. The lead predator lunged at her, its claws slashing through the air. Kara dodged, driving her spear into its side. It howled, the sound reverberating through the canyon, but it didn't slow. The smaller creatures closed in, their claws raking against her skin, but she fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. With her last ounce of strength, she activated the timer, setting it to a mere 30 seconds. She turned to run but stumbled, her legs giving out beneath her. Blood poured from countless wounds, her vision fading. In the distance, Elara reached the ridge, looking back in time to see the monolith begin to crack. The creatures writhed and howled as the explosives detonated, the shockwave ripping through the landscape. The monolith collapsed in on itself, a blinding light consuming everything. When the light faded, the valley was silent. Elara stood alone, her breath ragged. She scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of life, but there was nothing. No creatures, no monolith, no Kara. The planet seemed emptier than ever, the oppressive hum replaced by an eerie stillness. But the victory was hollow. Elara staggered, clutching her side. Her skin itched, and when she looked down, she saw the telltale black veins spreading beneath her flesh. She fell to her knees, her body convulsing as the infection took hold. The final moments of her humanity slipped away as she gazed at the barren landscape. She let out a guttural scream, one that echoed across the empty expanse, a sound of anguish and transformation. As the alien sun dipped below the horizon, the camera pulled back, revealing the planet, still and silent, yet alive with the knowledge that the cycle would begin again. The creatures were gone, but the infection remained, waiting for the next visitors to awaken it. And in the depths of the galaxy, the silence of the planet promised horrors yet to come.